I'm sure everyone's been asked the question, why do you watch that wrestling nonsense? Sometimes it can be a hard question to answer because when you really think about it, wrestling can be a little silly, can't it? Still, our world of wrestling fandom has to start somewhere, and for the vast majority of us, it started when we were kids. I can remember my dad and older brother watching WCW when it was on very late here in the UK during weekends. My earliest memories are of the Freebirds, Sting and Lex Luger. I can then remember years later watching Hogan vs Warrior from WrestleMania 6 at a friend's house because I didn't have Sky TV. And because I didn't have no real access to other shows, I kind of forgot about wrestling again. I just had no means of viewing it, but I remember being very engrossed in that Mania 6 main event. I then had a relative who let me borrow a tape from TV version of WrestleMania 9, and I was absolutely heartbroken at the end because that tape made me a Bret Hart fan. And then, in the middle of 1996, I finally got Sky TV and I became a full-blown fan in the middle of Shawn Michaels' WWF title run. I knew what wrestling was, I enjoyed watching wrestling previously, but I became a real weekly viewer just before the insanity of the Monday Night War began, and I made it a personal mission to see all the old stuff I'd missed out on before. In secondary school, I met a new friend who was a complete die-hard fan. He had so many videotapes of old WWF shows that I was able to borrow a new tape every other night and catch up on everything I missed. At one point, that boy managed to secure every single WWF pay-per-view event on VHS, whether it was a Coliseum video or tape from TV. So I became very much intrigued and excited about the history of the WWF, and from here, you begin expanding into WCW, Japanese wrestling, ECW, deathmatch wrestling, and all that stuff. That's my story, but I was very interested in hearing how you guys got into wrestling. I reached out on my YouTube community page and on Twitter to hear how other people became fans, and with over 1,000 replies in total, I knew I was in trouble. Then I started reading your comments, and I was surprised to find out that many people shared similar stories. Certain wrestlers came up more than others, and certain matches and moments captivated a wide range of viewers. So let's look at some wrestlers, matches and moments that came up frequently when I asked you the question, what match or promo made you become a fan of pro wrestling? Hulk Hogan's name came up frequently in the comments, and this is totally understandable. My audience skews towards an older male demographic, so a lot of you got captivated by the sport in the late 80s and early 90s. 1000 Bips said, the Battle Royal on the January or February 1987 Saturday night's main event. I knew about wrestling before this. I always watched Hulk Hogan's Rockin' Wrestling on Saturday mornings. I was 7 years old. I had seen Andre choke out Hogan on an earlier show, I don't remember which. All the other babyfaces were trying to help Hogan, but Andre kept going. Then came the Battle Royal, so much action, poor bloody leaping Lenny Poffo. Then Andre eliminated Hogan. I was hooked. Yes, the choke happened on the January 2nd, 1988 Saturday night's main event following a King Kong Bundy vs Hogan match. It took old Hacksaw Jim Duggan with his 2x4 to get Andre off of Hogan. The Battle Royal happened a year prior, and old Andre threw Hogan out of the ring with ease. Good times. Plenty of folks mentioned the Hogan vs Andre feud as the main reason why they became WWF fans, such as Joseph right here. Hogan losing to Andre at the main event 88. No matter what else happened, we always knew Hogan would prevail in the end, until one night he just didn't. I had to know what was going to happen. I was hooked. Danny said, I had already been watching WWF on TV here and there during the 80s, but Hogan vs Andre at Mania 3 did it for me. Was hooked ever since. Craziest thing I'd ever seen in my life up to that point. I was 9. From Wesley, dating myself here a bit, but Hulk Hogan vs Andre the Giant. I was 5 years old, didn't know anything about wrestling, but the sheer spectacle captivated my mind, and I was instantly a wrestling fan. It was like watching real-life superheroes. By the way, I've been watching Reliving the War since episode 1, discovered your channel while you were still doing wrestler profiles, and I want to thank you for all the hours of nostalgia you've provided, because I watched the Monday Night Wars from beginning to end. Thank you very much, Wesley. Another Hogan feud that grabbed your attention was Hulk Hogan vs Randy Savage. Andy tweeted, Mega Powers explode, Saturday night's main event. Hogan carried Elizabeth back to safety, abandoning Savage, who then came after Hogan. A classic moment that still holds up today for sure, but what do you guys think? Was Hogan in the right here, or was Macho Man in the right? A lot of folks got into wrestling because of Hogan vs Savage. House of Toski said, the match would have been Hulk Hogan vs Macho Man Randy Savage, WrestleMania 5. I don't remember much because I was 3, but I always remembered the hatred Macho Man had in his promos against Hogan, and just hearing the tagline, the mega powers explode, got me hooked. And here's another one from Israel Massey. The mega powers storyline drew me in. Hogan vs Warrior, WrestleMania 6 kept me a fan. Out of all the Hogan rivalries over the years though, one in particular got mentioned way more than others. And do keep in mind I'm only selecting a few tweets and comments here. There's loads more if you check out the community post and the tweet I put out. But Hogan vs Warrior at Mania 6 got mentioned way more than any other match, and I'm not surprised either honestly. That match captured the imagination of so many young fans. Nathan said, I watched for him ever since I could remember, even as a young child, but the first major feud I could remember from that age was Hogan vs Warrior at Mania 6. I was all for Hogan and my brother was all for Warrior. Despite whatever their personal views may be, that feud had me and my brother entranced at the time. I saw Hogan vs Warrior at WrestleMania on VHS when I was very young. I think the characters and theatrics got me hooked. WrestleMania 6 Hogan vs Warrior was the first wrestling VHS I ever saw in like 94 or 95. Hogan vs Warrior Mania 6, man, what an atmosphere. Even after all these years, it holds up, and I'm not a fan of either man anymore, but at the time the Ultimate Warrior was awesome. Dave said, it's probably Hogan vs Warrior, first match I remember vividly at Mania 6, but I would have started to watch wrestling the year prior. My friend showed me some promos and matches he taped off TV, and all I remember was the Macho Man and Hulk Hogan, larger than life. For me, it would have been when Champion vs Champion, WrestleMania 6. Just amazing to see Hogan going against Warrior, and made me so happy to see Hulk Hogan lose for a change instead of making him win all the time. It was nice to see Warrior up on the ropes with both WWF belts. Great match between them both, and I'm so glad I've got the I'm so glad I remember all these pay-per-views on my Tag Classic DVDs. Very pleased I bought them all now, WWF all the way. It wasn't just these rivalries that made you guys wrestling fans and Hulkamaniacs. Other Hogan matches and moments were also mentioned. King Kong Bundy vs Hulk Hogan cage match. I remember thinking to myself, what the heck is this? I want more of this. JR Wheezy says, the Hogan Sting Starrcade build-up was what made me start watching regularly. I watched every now and again before, but that made me love WCW and wrestling altogether. Rock Hogan Mania 18 is my all-time favourite match. Not great in ring, but the crowd were absolutely out of this world. I don't remember the match that got me hooked, but my earliest memory is SmackDown in 2002. Hollywood Hulk Hogan made his entrance to confront Kurt Angle before his match against Edge at Judgment Day. For many of us, it was late 80s and early 90s WWF. I saw the preview for Survivor Series 1989 randomly while switching channels on my TV one Saturday morning, and I saw Hulk Hogan. Being a little boy without a father, his messages and his presence resonated with me instantly. Wrestling got me through a challenging childhood. The superstars of that era were real-life superheroes to many of us.
I'm just a sexy boy.
Shawn Michaels is one of my favourite wrestlers of all time, possibly taking the #1 spot. I'm also a huge Bret Hart fan, so I'm one of those rare cats who can comfortably say I like both guys without feeling like I need to pick a side. Loads of you guys were first drawn into pro wrestling because of Shawn Michaels. One moment got brought up quite a lot, while two matches in particular got mentioned quite a few times. Shawn Michaels putting Marty Jannetty through the barbershop window. I'd been aware of big names like Hogan, but never watched pro wrestling. A friend in school had a Rockers shirt, so I tuned in the next chance I got to see why he was a fan. When that glass broke, I was hooked. I'd say the first match will be Hogan vs Warrior at Mania 6. Absolute dog shit to watch now, but as a kid it was the best thing ever. But the one that just had me hooked in a storyline was the Rockers at the barbershop. It's a shame Marty never got to give Shawn the comeuppance he deserved. Still get emotional about that window to this day. Brands Now says, HBK's heel turn at the barber shop. It was so before its time. Nothing like that was ever seen before, and it made me want to see more. Only other things that were more brutal but was censored out was Ron Bass attacking Brutus before SummerSlam 88. Punctuation, guys, fuck's sake. Those were so shocking moments at the time that no one seen coming. GP said, I grew up watching with my dad. Nothing in particular made me a fan except wanting to hang out with my dad. Earliest memory was the Rockers breaking up with Shawn kicking Marty through the barber glass. 2 HBK matches got brought up more than others, those being the Razor Ramon ladder match at Mania 10 and the WrestleMania 12 Iron Man match against Bret Hart. HBK vs Razor at Mania 10. My cousin would rent out old VHS tapes from the store, and I remember quite a few, like Mania 6, before this one won me over. And then seeing HBK win at Mania 12 made me a super fan. I believe I saw that in 1996, so the summer or fall after it happened. For me, it was the Razor and HBK ladder match. My cousin had it on VHS, and I was 7 when I saw it, and thought it was badass. Panasonic Youth. So for me, the first wrestling pay-per-view I watched was the Royal Rumble 1993. So seeing so many awesome wrestlers coming out was just incredible and so much fun. But for me, the match that solidified me as a true fan was Razor Ramon vs Shawn Michaels ladder match at Mania 10. I'd been watching for a year at this point, but this was the match that blew my mind. I was already a fan of sports entertainment from like 1990, 8 years old, but no match really stood out to me until we rented a VHS of WrestleMania 10 and I saw Shawn Michaels vs Razor Ramon in their epic ladder match. At 12, I could really appreciate it. Before that, I really got into the Doink and Crush feud and any $1 Million Man heel work. WrestleMania 10, the first televised ladder match between Shawn Michaels and Razor Ramon, revolutionized the industry. What a classic. The Iron Man match getting mentioned didn't surprise me. I know it kinda gets a bad rep nowadays, but watching that match back in 1996 was really something else. 2 of the absolute best and the company's 2 biggest babyfaces. I don't care what anyone says, it's still one of my favourite matches of all time. I was already vaguely into wrestling as a kid as far back as I can remember, but one memory really stands out as my first dip into true fandom. My brother and I were staying the night at my granddad's house, and we flipped the TV to the pay-per-view channel for WrestleMania 12. We didn't order the show, so we couldn't see anything, but for some reason the sound still came through. We listened to the entire Iron Man match like a radio drama, and after that I became a huge Shawn Michaels fan. Medley, I think the characters made me a fan first. Macho, Hogan, Taker. But for matches, I think Shawn vs Bret at Mania 12 made me a serious fan of the business. I thought they were invincible going for a straight R in the ring, rest holds aside. Bret was my guy, #jam. The WrestleMania 12 Iron Man match. Seeing the recap of Shawn Michaels' journey from the 95 Royal Rumble to the concussion to winning the 1996 Royal Rumble, and then the performances from Shawn and Bret hooked me in. I rented and watched a lot of wrestling tapes in the mid to late 90s. Florida Man in Maine. I'd been watching wrestling since I was real young, so I don't remember which match got me in, but one match that solidified my love in wrestling was Bret Hart vs Shawn Michaels at Mania 12. The match between HBK and Owen Hart where Shawn got his kayfabe concussion. 12-year-old me totally fell for it, and I had to keep watching to see if he'd recover. The Iron Man match with Bret at Mania 12 sealed the deal. There were loads more comments about Shawn Michaels, proving that the Heartbreak Kid served as a great introduction to pro wrestling for a lot of young fans. Mine's an interesting one because the one that stood out the most and which I can recall fully was the Tatanka vs Shawn Michaels match on Superstars that was shown on September 9th, 1995. I did rent VHS tapes of WWF pay-per-views prior to that event. For me, the first wrestling event I ever watched was WrestleMania 25. The match that got me completely hooked was, of course, HBK vs Undertaker. That match absolutely made me fall in love with wrestling, and for a long time it made me think WrestleMania 25 was a great show until I watched it back several years later. Shawn's been my favourite wrestler of all time ever since, and I've yet to see a match top what that match made me feel almost 16 years later. WrestleMania 25, Shawn Michaels vs The Undertaker. It was the first wrestling match I ever watched. The atmosphere and commentary from JR and Michael Cole instantly got me hooked. For me, it was spring of '96 when Shawn Michaels was facing the Bulldog. When Diana said, "I know that you want me," and HBK's response was, "With all due respect, please do not flatter yourself," I was hooked. I cannot recall the exact match that got me hooked. I started watching when I was 4 years old in 2006 with my dad and my brother. The one match that I do vividly remember watching is Ric Flair vs Shawn Michaels at Mania 24 in 2008. I've always been a big fan of Shawn Michaels. The ending where he said, "I'm sorry, I love you" to Flair before hitting the sweet chin music always gets to me. It's funny that the pick on this post is a Royal Rumble. I knew Hogan, Undertaker and Bret Hart somehow in the early 90s, but the moment I saw Shawn Michaels superkick Diesel out of the ring in 1996 to win the Royal Rumble match was the instant I'll never quit wrestling, and it all started with the WCW NWO vs WWF war. That's why your channel is all my childhood, and I couldn't thank you enough for your work. Thank you very much for your comment, it means a lot. Whether it was his breakout WWF matches against Bret Hart, his memorable fight against The Rock at Mania 17, or his no-nonsense promos, Steve Austin got a lot of you guys into pro wrestling, and again, it's not surprising. The wrestling business truly boomed when Stone Cold got to the top, and it's only natural that many folks' first pro wrestling memories were centered around the Texas Rattlesnake. Austin Undertaker at SummerSlam 98. I stopped watching in the early 90s, the dead man was my favourite and I was glad he was still around. The respect everyone on the roster had for him at that time, before his major heel turn later in the year, really chimed with how I felt. That Dan Bradley also brought up the SummerSlam 98 match. I was attracted to pro wrestling as a child, I mean single digits, so I was kinda hooked from the start, but there is one match I remember seeing that I knew as a 5-year-old was a good match. It was Austin and Undertaker at SummerSlam 98. To me, that was the first match that made me understand what a good match was. And it's crazy because Austin vs Dude Love from Over the Edge and Undertaker vs Mankind at King of the Ring had already happened. But for whatever reason, Steve Austin vs Undertaker at MSG was the first match I actually thought was good, and not just part of the TV show I was watching. Some random guy said, "My parents hated wrestling, but they knew I was obsessed with it. So for my 10th birthday, my dad found a Stone Cold Steve Austin biography 3-disc set with his matches from WCCW, WCW, ECW and WWF. And the one match I always got drawn to was Stone Cold vs Shawn Michaels, King of the Ring 97. Yeah man, my first moment that brought me in was the Tyson Austin promo of 98. I remember hearing that Mike Tyson was going to be on Raw and I never watched before that. I was 13 at the time and my dad was and is a huge boxing fan, so I knew all about Tyson. When I heard about him coming to Raw, I had to see him on TV. I watched that whole episode and it was over from there. Besides seeing Ric Flair and Arn Anderson tag team matches in WCW when I was 6 or 7, my very first memory of wrestling was watching WrestleMania 14. It was Steve Austin vs Shawn Michaels that got me into wrestling in the first place. King of the Ring, the birth of Austin 316. We are in the Philippines, so we rented a VHS tape for that. It's Holy Week here, so nothing to watch on TV, so we rented that pay-per-view. Austin 316 promo on Holy Week. So far, I've only brought up WWF guys, but loads and loads of people got into wrestling because of Jim Crockett Promotions and WCW. Whether it was during the studio days, early WCW, or even the Nitro era, many of you first got introduced to pro wrestling far away from the WWF. Vader vs Flair at Starrcade 93. Camera crew picking Flair up from his house, him telling his family bye, him talking to Scheme Gene in the limo, and he's not cutting cocky promos, he's scared. They made Vader come off as a killer, and that build was one of the greatest things WCW ever done, and the match lived up to the build. If I can just chime in here for a moment, yes, Vader vs Flair at Starrcade 93 was a special match and a special night. I made a video on it ages ago, but like most creators, I absolutely despise my older work. I'd love to cover this again, only do the whole pay-per-view and the whole build-up, maybe when Reliving the War comes to an end. I remember as a kid watching WCW back in the late 90s. I saw someone mimic DDP's Diamond Cutter taunt in a promo saying he will turn that into this, proceeded to hold it over his crotch. But for me personally, I got into wrestling due to my dad's love of the AWA, so I have a soft spot for the old guys, but I'm always a die-hard supporter of Eric Bischoff's WCW. The Cruiserweight division got me hooked. It was the War Games match at Fall Brawl 96, and little 8-year-old me was so invested in the whole thing. That was the first ever pay-per-view I ever watched, and the ending when Sting was telling the truth the whole time, and all of WCW didn't believe him. But I believed in Sting, and I didn't like that the NWO won the match. But I also, at the time, thought Sting was justified in leaving the match. In my eyes, Sting can do no wrong. He was my guy no matter what. Arcane Anarchy. I was introduced to wrestling, or reintroduced as I enjoyed it as a kid, by my next door neighbour at 15, watching a WCW pay-per-view. It was cool and I liked it. What hooked me though is whenever Sting dropped down or appeared to take out the NWO, it was just so exciting and made me watch next week. You never knew what would happen. I really enjoyed reading comments from folks who got into wrestling during the Nitro era. It's slightly irritating how WCW gets used as a punchline these days, and let's be honest, a subsection of AEW fans like to compare All Elite Wrestling to WCW because they struggle to compare their favourite company to modern WWE. But WCW from mid-1995 onwards had some incredible moments and matches, and these moments and matches still hold up extremely well to this very day. If they had the ability to grab your attention as a first time viewer and keep you tuning in every week, then they did a good job. Nitro, March 98, Hogan, Nash and Hall vs Sting, Savage and Giant. I was 13, I never recovered. So much star power, it made me an instant fan. By the way, I'm French, and at the time, nobody watched wrestling in France. We only had 45 minutes of Nitro, Saturday mornings at 7 AM, with a month delay from the US. Oh, I thought a 5-day delay was bad. Imagine trying to avoid spoilers if there was a month delay in today's wrestling. Times were so different before the internet became widespread. I think it was probably Jericho's conspiracy promos. Those were so different from anything going on at the time. Today I'd say it was reminiscent of public access TV, but it was just jarring watching wrestling and that came on. I grew up watching it with my mom, and I can't recall a particular match that flipped the switch for me from watching with a parent to a standalone fan, but I can tell you the post-match moment. It was DDP putting on the NWO shirt, then hitting the cutter on Hall behind Nash. Such a great moment, and a moment Dallas actually talked about when I covered it for Reliving the War. I still can't believe that DDP came onto my dumb little weekly show. What a guy. One night when I was about 5 or 6, my dad left me alone in his room while he went outside for a smoke. I was watching cartoons when boredom hit, so I started fooling around with the remote and I accidentally ended up on TNT, which was showing Monday Night Nitro. I just remember Sting was cutting a promo and I was hooked ever since. My first memory of being blown away by a match, I was 6 years old and it was Clash of the Champions 1989 Flair vs Steamboat Best 2 out of 3 Falls. I remember watching it with my dad and brothers. That, along with 6:05 every Saturday evening watching the NWA WCW, is what made me love wrestling. Those who were fans of the art of wrestling watched WCW, while those who loved the art of a wrestler's gimmick watched the WWF. When WCW closed their doors, there was a lot of fans who left wrestling and never came back. Wrestling died to them the day WCW did. Okay. I remember it was 1996, I was 2, my dad was watching WCW Monday Nitro telling me, buddy, you gotta watch wrestling with me, you're gonna love it. I was like, why not, it looks cool. From the opening match to the main event, I was hooked. I cannot remember who his opponent was, but it was when I first saw Eddie Guerrero wrestle that made me fall in love with wrestling. Then it was the story of who is the third man with Scott Hall and Kevin Nash that got me even more hooked, and I've been a lifelong fan of wrestling ever since. I don't even remember who, honestly. I think I watched WCW with my parents, I was not really into it. And then Goldberg came out to his epic music with police security, ran some poor guy over and went away. I was hooked. Then I watched Bret Hart promoing with style, then the NWO while they were still good. Man, I miss the good WCW era. I never liked any of, at the time, WWF, but WCW was my jam. Retro JR, Great American Bash 1990 is what made me a WCW fan. I went out with the family and came home just as the Sting vs Ric Flair match began, and seeing Sting beating Flair for the WCW title was perfect for months of build-up. Ruffle Crabs, friend of the channel. It's a weird one, but Kenyon vs Saturn at the Great American Bash 98. That match was on when I hit record on the VCR, missed Benoit vs Booker. The guys looked cool, their music was cool compared to what I was used to hearing on the radio as a kid, and the wrestling was great. When Luger beat Hogan for the title on Nitro, I wasn't even a fan of Luger. I was an NWO fan at the time, but I'd only started watching a few months before that, and Luger winning on Nitro made me think anything could happen at any show, not just pay-per-views. Thomas Austin, Road Wild 98, NWO vs Wolfpack vs Goldberg. I was less than 2, but my parents would back me up about this match in particular. Since I was a baby, I was a Scott Hall fan, so I think his involvement is what did it. It was a slow burn for me. My church friends were big into WCW during 1997 and I was an NBA fan, so we all had a Bash at the Beach watch party to watch the Hogan Rodman vs Luger Giant match. After that, I slowly started getting into WCW and watching Nitro, with the occasional glimpse at Raw. That led to ordering my first pay-per-view for my birthday, Halloween Havoc 97. Let's just say I came for Hogan Piper and I got Guerrero Mysterio. If I had to pinpoint one exact match that introduced me to the wider concept of pro wrestling and what it could be, it would probably be that Eddie and Ray match. Can't remember exactly which, but a Rey Mysterio vs Chris Jericho match on WCW. Not because the match blew me away or did something spectacular, but because that was the match when wrestling clicked for me and I, for the first time, realised that the performers were telling a story in the ring. That was when I really got it and started to see a lot more than just flashy moves. Before we look at another wrestler who grabbed your attention early on, a lot of you guys got introduced to pro wrestling not by watching it on TV or attending shows, but by playing video games. It's so cool to think that many people didn't even know who the characters were within the wrestling games they were playing, yet they still enjoyed playing so much that it actually turned them into full-blown pro wrestling fans who would tune into wrestling shows each and every week. I'd picked up an interest on wrestling because my cousin had a copy of SmackDown vs Raw 2007 for his Xbox 360 back in the day. I started watching not long after Mania 25, got invested in the CM Punk vs Jeff Hardy feud, and pirated SummerSlam to watch that TLC match. Jake with Onions, I became a fan through playing Here Comes the Pain with my older brothers. They didn't like wrestling, but the games were always fun. So eventually, I started actually watching in like 2006, but don't really remember what got me into it. Fell off 4 years later, came back in 2019. Do video games count? SmackDown 2 Know Your Role was one of my earliest wrestling memories. Honestly, SmackDown Shut Your Mouth got me into wrestling, and from there it started with Undertaker. Loved the character and the eye roll to get me watching. The intro to WCW Nitro, the video game for PS1. Awful intro, but the intro, which I believe was the same one for the TV show at the time, hooked 10-year-old me in for life. Not a match, but a match within a video game. Bret vs Austin, WrestleMania 13 in the 2K16 showcase. Got me hooked into wrestling and I've been watching ever since. Rob Stewart said, honestly, playing WWF Warzone on PS1. I'd never heard of pro wrestling before that. To be honest, it was the games that hooked me in first before I watched, and that was WCW NWO Revenge and SmackDown Shut Your Mouth. Oh, Showdown Legends of Wrestling really hooked me with 70s to 90s wrestlers. Rented the hell out of that game. Sorry, I know you said matches, but this is what brought me in. It was actually video games, a combination of WCW Revenge, WWE All-Stars and WWE 13. Enjoyed them so much that I started watching Raw. It wasn't a match, it was a video game called Day of Reckoning. For me, it's WrestleMania 19. I got into wrestling via the GameCube game and watched the show due to loving this game. The intro of this Mania gives me goosebumps every time. If I had to choose a match, Angle vs Lesnar and Michaels vs Jericho. Loving this channel for years now. Greetings from Germany. Thank you very, very much. The excellence of execution, the greatest in-ring storyteller of all time. Now that I think about it, Bret vs Yokozuna at Mania 9 was probably the match that made me a Bret Hart fan, even though that particular match doesn't show off the Hitman's abilities at all when it comes to technical wrestling. But it must have did something to my little brain because I couldn't get enough of the Hitman after that bout. Actually, I couldn't get access to any other Bret matches, so I had no choice. Bret got his rematch against Yokozuna the following year, and a few of you guys were really captivated by the Mania 10 main event. Luigi said, Bret Hart vs Yokozuna at WrestleMania 10. It was way before I knew wrestling was scripted and thought it was unbelievable that Bret could beat such a big guy. It was the first time I'd heard of WrestleMania 2. Bret Hart at WrestleMania 10 vs Yokozuna. I'd never even seen wrestling before and it wasn't an amazing match. Bret vs Owen was way better, but this man limping to the ring, winning the belt was like all the heroics I needed as an 8-year-old. A few other Bret matches got mentioned more than once, but the one bout you guys talked about more than any other was the WrestleMania 13 submission match. Chubby Catfish. I started watching wrestling in late 1996 and fell in love with it instantly. The first match that I saw that truly pulled me in for good was Bret Hart vs Steve Austin at Mania 13. I was hooked for life then. It was such a fight that actually felt like there was real animosity. Plus the finish was amazing and the aftermath. The first one was the submission match between Bret Hart and Stone Cold. The story was amazing and I don't really believe, all things considered, it's been topped. Restart. I fell out of wrestling for years, wasn't paying attention that much, but it all clicked at Mania 13 with Bret vs Austin. The brutality of it, Austin refusing to give up and His Excellency just being the best wrestler in the world. I was hooked again till about 05, I think. I was a wrestling fan because of my dad and played the games for years, but never really watched it because I didn't have a big TV provider, just basic free TV. Eventually though, my dad bought me a couple of wrestling DVDs from a pawn shop. 2 of them were WrestleMania 25 and a Stone Cold DVD. The 2 matches that made me a hardcore wrestling fan and completely blew my mind was Shawn Michaels vs Taker at Mania 25 and Stone Cold vs Bret Hart at Mania 13. Those matches are just peak wrestling athleticism and storytelling. The Hitman's ability to draw viewers in was evident throughout more matches that you guys brought up in the comments. Freddie brought up an all-timer, as did a few other people. The first ever match I can remember with such clarity was Mr. Perfect vs Bret Hart at SummerSlam 91. I could tell it was special because outside of the main event with Hogan and Warrior, as well as the wedding with Macho Man and Elizabeth, I couldn't tell you what else took place on that show years later. Even remembering who was in the main event, I remember less of what took place in that match than the IC title match. So all these years later, it was definitely the match that got me really hooked on watching. Bret Hart vs Kevin Nash, Survivor Series 95. 20 minutes of intensity between the two going all out. Fantastic chemistry, spots like the first Spanish announce table spot on WWF pay-per-view. Great finish with Bret playing dead and rolling Nash up. Kevin's tweener turn at the end. Yeah, totally agreed, and I'm not sure if this match is now fallen into the underrated category, but I recall loads of friends ranting and raving about this one when I was just getting back into wrestling in 1996. Survivor Series 95 was one of the first tapes I borrowed from that friend I mentioned at the start of the video. I'd love to remember the very first match I saw. It would have been something on Sky 1 in 1992. I can remember knowing everyone on the poster a friend got from SummerSlam at Wembley that year. I do remember the first pay-per-view I managed to watch start to finish, and that was the 1993 King of the Ring. Bret Hart remains the person I think of first when the word hero is mentioned, and I imagine many are the same. His run from that King of the Ring through to SummerSlam against Owen the following year holds a special place in my heart. This wasn't the only time the 1993 King of the Ring was mentioned, as the Magician B posted, I'd watched wrestling for 1 or 2 years before this and was a huge Bret Hart fan, but what really cemented my love of wrestling was Bret's run to winning the King of the Ring 93. His performance that night was phenomenally good as he put on 3 top class matches against 3 completely different opponents. I was 8 years old and knew wrestling was a show, but like the best actors on the silver screen, Bret really drew me in to believe in everything I was seeing. The match that made me fall in love with professional wrestling was Piper vs Bret Hart at Mania 8. I had seen it on the recommendation of a different Irish YouTuber, Super Eyepatch Wolf, and I was just so taken by it. It was such a gripping, beautiful story told by larger-than-life characters in a medium I was unfamiliar with. I simply had to see more. Hogan, Austin, Bret and Shawn came up more times than anyone else, but there were also a ton of other matches and promos mentioned that ranged from understandable to downright questionable. The thing is, it only takes one little thing to hook viewers in, and usually these things are just viewed when flipping through TV channels. To wrap up, I'll cover some random matches and moments that got you guys into pro wrestling. Voice of Reason said, "I'm 51 and most of the guys I know were all made pro wrestling fans by the match featuring Rocky Balboa and Thunder Lips. I couldn't stop talking about it, asking my dad all kinds of questions about wrestling. He was a fan in the 50s and 60s as a kid." This is intriguing and it shows us how important cross-promotion can be when done correctly. You don't need to see Hulkamania running wild in a wrestling ring. Just seeing Thunder Lips and Rocky 3 on the big screen could have been enough to make you a fan for life. Ken Shamrock vs Triple H, first show I ever saw on holiday and didn't watch wrestling again for 2 years, but that stuck in my head. I don't even think it was a very good match or anything, but I had never seen anything like that before, so 7-year-old me was amazed. I totally get it, and I like the randomness and honesty of this comment. It doesn't have to be a great match or a match that gets talked about all that often. Something can just click when watching a wrestling show and it can make you a fan just like that. I'm not sure exactly what Shamrock vs Triple H match is being mentioned here though. It wasn't the match, but I remember walking into my basement and turning on the TV and saw Lex Luger body slam Yokozuna. Fan ever since. Mate, if that worked for you brother, then that's what worked for you. Money in the Bank ladder match from WrestleMania 24. John Morrison picked up a ladder and did a backflip onto 4 dudes, and 4-year-old me was never the same. Raven vs Tommy Dreamer on ECW was what made me into a wrestling fan. I included this because it is a rivalry you need to check out if you haven't done so already. Even if you don't care for ECW, you still want to see it. And finally, here's one that I think's going to resonate with a lot of people. I don't think it was a match, but I was born into a wrestling fan. I was born in the new generation era, and believe it or not, it was the colourful world of wrestling, like action figures, video games, TV shows, trading cards, ice cream bars. Wrestling was family bonding. I guess I could say, in one way, I was a second and third generation wrestling fan. Yeah, maybe it wasn't a particular match that got you into wrestling, maybe it was just the entire wrestling package that captivated you as a kid. The bright lights, the music, the merchandise, the characters, all that stuff. Anyway, that's going to do it for today. I'm sorry if your comments didn't get mentioned here, but there was just so many. I did read them all though, and I really enjoyed finding out how you guys got into pro wrestling. I want to do this again, only next time I'm maybe going to ask you why you stopped watching wrestling. So keep an eye out on my community page for that one. Thanks for watching folks, and please take care.